Hey, what is up everybody? In this video I'm going to talk about my recent commercial videography and photography trip to Boston, Massachusetts. First off, I was going to talk a little bit about the decisions to fly and rent versus driving with my own equipment or even flying with my own equipment on this trip and how that ended up working out. I was going to talk about the equipment that I did end up renting and how that worked, and also the equipment I brought. Talk a little bit about the nuance of the actual job I was doing there and some of the thinking process and the actual work that was going on from day to day. And lastly, I thought I would touch a little bit about the unique financial aspect of this job. I'd quoted it different than you would usually quote a job when you are traveling. But anyways, to get started, I did decide to fly and then rent equipment, and I was kind of thinking about if that was the right decision. One thing for me, and that's just specific to this time of year, is I do not like to drive in the snow anymore, and heading from Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, out to Boston, Massachusetts, I was a little bit worried about the weather in the mountains in PA. I found that the airline travel time was about 3/4 what it would have taken me to drive, roughly. You know, there's always little nuances in, traffic and then flight delays. Travel time I've estimated each way was about 7 or 8 hours, and that you have to calculate in time getting to the airport, obviously, being to the airport as early as you feel comfortable or as late as you feel comfortable, depending on who you are. I think on the way out, that is very important to consider because I actually flew out with plenty of time in case something went wrong. This is a job that I had 3 days to shoot, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So I was making sure I was getting in early on Tuesday. So even though I'm saying the travel time was way less with flying, and even with some of the hassles of flying, like the transportation to and from when you board a plane, the chance of delays on the plane, I also had to calculate in having a bunch of extra hours in case something went wrong with a connecting flight. It was really nice. My layovers were very short, I think under an hour each way, so it was pretty efficient. But when I break that down and think it would have taken me 11 hours to drive to Boston, I start to think that's not that much longer, and then you can leave when you want, so it just really kind of changes the calculation there. That's another thing I think we don't often build into the idea of air travel is you're arranging your schedule around the planes, which you don't have to do when you're driving to an extent. Obviously, you'll be passing through big cities or stuff like that. You might want to time against rush hour. So nothing is ever really totally cut and dry. My airline tickets were about $600, I believe, and I didn't even check any bags. Obviously, it would have cost more if I was traveling with gear. It would have still cost me less to travel with my own gear than it did to rent gear. So I rented 2 lights, 2 light stands, and the lighting modifiers to go with them, and that cost me $400. I think flying with my stuff would have cost me $200. Looking into the driving cost, I used a fuel calculator, which told me it would have cost me $62 to drive. Seems way lower than I expected, so $62 each way, but say that estimate is low, and still take that to $200, and bringing my own gear, I'm at $200 or less. Flying, renting gear, I was already at $1,000. So a couple things to consider when talking about traveling. There's all kinds of other nuances that I'm, bring up in the comments and stuff like that. Planes, like I mentioned, getting delayed. I was flying into a nor'easter. It actually turned out to be a benefit. It evaporated around Boston somehow and never really hit, even though it hit other areas on the East Coast. So when I got to Boston, we were able to move around the city completely with ease because everything had actually been canceled. That's a rare benefit to flying. That's usually not how it'd be, and I also would have benefited from showing up in the city and not sitting in traffic in my own car. Another negative about driving is obviously you can't work while you're driving, if you're driving yourself, obviously. I was thinking that, say you're someone who gets to the airport 2 hours early, so maybe there's about an hour to work at the airport way earlier than you actually fly out. And my flights were a little over an hour each. You can't work on your computer during takeoff and descent. So, roughly 50 minutes in there, but I did get editing done on the plane. The actual equipment I rented were Profoto B1X, and it was their travel set. It was awesome. They were no cords. They were battery powered. Using these lights was a breeze and intuitive. I really didn't have to think much. I set them up, of course, the night before and practiced with them because I had never used them. I just triggered them optically, but you could also buy like the right radio slaves and that. And so if you're in a situation where radio slaves would have been necessary, but it was super intuitive. I'd also build that into the time of renting over owning with my own gear. I don't need to practice with it, obviously, but they were cool. And I think it adds a lot of efficiency not to have cords and cables and worry about them. Just popping a battery on, turning them on. Digital interface on the back is nice, but my old school ones with dials and switches really aren't that much more complicated. You're not really going to save time on that stuff. It's just a nice modern feature. Great lights. They said to get 300 flash flashes at full power, and they were very powerful lights, so very impressive. But also, I looked up the cost. The replacement cost is listed as $5,200. It looks like you could get this kit for closer to $4,000 online, but at that price, I'm not going to be upgrading yet. The stands were really cool, Manfrotto stands, the way they folded up sideways and locked together. Never used them like that. And then I had Wescott Octoboxes, which were 48 inches. Again, took me a minute to play around with how they actually like unfold and set up. Still pretty intuitive, and the mounts were different than mine, but easy to understand. The second you look at it, you just see it slides onto the lights. So I love doing the work with those lights. I'm going to be showing some of that work in a future video. I'm not even done editing yet, and the client hasn't received all the work, even though this YouTube channel is tiny. I just don't like to put that stuff out there till I'm done, as you can imagine. I also flew with my drone and did some drone footage, and same thing. I'm not done like going through that and uploading and editing it, so I wouldn't mind talking a little bit about that in a future video as well. So the other thing I was going to talk about is the way I bid this job. I didn't bid this job like you would normally bid a traveling job, as being like, here's what it cost me just for my work, and then here's what it cost me to travel and my accommodations and my food, so everything that goes with traveling when you're working. I bid this job, or quoted this job actually, on basically the local market. And it just so happens that, you know, the local market in a place like Boston or Phil, in any major city, the rates are so much higher than I can get in Cuyahoga Falls, Akron, or even say Northeast Ohio. So I was actually paying for everything out of pocket against what I was making. So that had to be part of the calculation if this was worth it. It was for me, because those rates are just so much higher. The day rates and the editing that a big corporation in Boston is willing to pay is just different. I was also, and the reason I was able to quote the job like this is because I knew somebody at the company. They were looking for quotes, and they just asked if I can make a quote in some kind of range work, and asked me to put one in, which got accepted. The other thing is, because I do have good friends out there, they put me up and helped with almost all of the transportation. I wasn't paying to stay, and I wasn't most of the time paying to get around or waiting to get around. So that's another thing that made this job possible, where it might not have been in other cases. When I am traveling with different companies and they are sending me to travel, I am obviously quoting my day rate, getting an estimate on travel, but then food and lodging and all that is covered by them. So you could see how this was like kind of a really different situation. A little bit of the nuts and bolts of the job, it was a mix of kind of everything. So some of it was like journalistic style photographing in the warehouses and factories and on the squid boat. Other things we were doing, I was setting up the lights and doing product photography. And then we were also doing kind of that stock image of employees and stuff like that, where we were setting up the shots and lighting them really well. I was also switching in my mind between video and photography mode. Even though they're very similar and modern cameras make it really easy to switch back and forth to the settings you need, I still find they're different frames of mind, and it is a lot more mental work when you are doing both in the same locations. That's also something to consider. I don't really know what you can do about it if you don't have the budget to hire someone separate, but I so often see why people do hire separate people, and I have videographer friends who will hire me as the photographer, and I would do the same in the other case. And I spent a couple extra days. I was also gathering some footage of just the city and stuff for the company. I did come home and back up the data every day and start uploads of files that I could upload. They also had the fastest Wi-Fi I've ever seen. It's faster than my wired connection here at home, which is kind of frustrating. It was great for a week. So that's going to be about it for this video. I do want to dive into each of these topics a little more in future videos as they come up. I also, with the product photography type stuff, I want to just do some of my own setups and filming in here so I could show what I'm doing when it's not client work, and I'm not worried about, one, time, two, whether I could even show their products or not, and three, I can't remember three. Oh yeah, three is like and subscribe. I will see you in the next video.